There are stories that keep you up at night, and then there are stories like this. It was a quiet town in Austria. Clean streets, trimmed hedges, peaceful homes. The kind of place where bad things aren't supposed to happen. Where neighbors smile at one another. Where children ride their bikes without fear. And where the worst thing people expected was maybe a thunderstorm or a broken pipe. But underneath one of those cheerful yellow homes, evil lived in silence. Real evil. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that wears a family name. Hidden behind walls and 8 layers of locked doors, a young woman spent 24 years of her life in a cellar. Never seeing the sun, never stepping outside, never knowing freedom. Her captor wasn't a stranger. Not a kidnapper. Not someone lurking in the shadows. Her captor was her own father. And upstairs? He was drinking coffee, waving to neighbors, hosting barbecues, and living like any other man. For 2.5 decades, nobody suspected a thing. Today on Wednesday Crime Gist, we're telling the true story of Elisabeth Fritzl and the man the world came to know as the monster of Amstetten. This is a case of silence, secrets, and survival. So if you're the kind of person who doesn't shy away from hard truths, if you believe that some stories must be told even when they're painful, then hit that subscribe button because this one is going to stay with you. Long before the basement was built, long before Elisabeth was ever born, the man who would go on to commit one of Austria's most disturbing crimes was already learning how to hurt people. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935, in Amstetten, a small town in Lower Austria. His early life was shaped by pain, silence, and fear, an atmosphere that would leave deep scars. His father, Josef Fritzl Sr., was a heavy drinker, absent for most of his son's life, and eventually left the family when Joseph was just 4 years old. That same year, the war would claim his father for good. He never returned from the battlefield. That left Joseph alone with his mother, Maria, a woman he would later describe in contradictory terms, sometimes calling her the best woman in the world, other times revealing that she was violent, harsh, and emotionally cold. According to Joseph himself, his mother often beat him with anything she could find: belts, shoes, sometimes her bare hands. There was no warmth, no bedtime stories, no comfort. Maria demanded obedience. She insulted her son constantly, telling him he would amount to nothing. She called him names no child should hear. Joseph would later claim he never once received a kiss or hug from her as a child. These are the moments where darkness begins to take shape, not just in bruises, but in beliefs. Joseph learned early that power came through control, and control came through fear. That lesson would stick with him for life. He didn't cry much. He learned not to. Austria at the time was still recovering from the harsh grip of war. Discipline, strict rules, and silence were common in many households. But what Joseph endured wasn't ordinary parenting. It was cruelty disguised as order. As he grew older, Joseph's behavior became cold and distant. Teachers noted he was smart, clever, even, but there was something off. He didn't have many friends. He didn't seem to enjoy laughter the way others did. He watched more than he spoke, listened more than he shared. And what he did share was often coded in anger or arrogance. After finishing compulsory school, Joseph pursued electrical engineering. He was ambitious. He studied hard. And by his early 20s, he landed jobs with local engineering firms, building a reputation as someone who could fix almost anything. But behind the technical skill was a man obsessed with dominance. In 1956, at age 21, Joseph married Rosemary, a quiet 17-year-old girl who, by many accounts, was soft-spoken and kind. They moved into a modest home in Amstetten, the same home that would later become the center of a global nightmare. It wasn't long after their wedding that Joseph's mother, Maria, moved in with the young couple. But instead of continuing the cycle of mistreatment from mother to son, Joseph flipped the roles. According to later reports, he began treating Maria like a prisoner. One day he locked her in the attic of their home and bricked up her windows. To outsiders he told them she had died. In reality he kept her confined for what some believe was up to 20 years, until she eventually passed away in 1980. This wasn't just revenge. It was a rehearsal. The same tactics he used on his mother, isolation, control, lies, would later be mirrored in what he did to his daughter. But no one knew. To neighbors he was strict, yes, but not dangerous. Joseph and Rosemary went on to have 7 children. 4 daughters and 3 sons. One of them was Elisabeth, born in 1966. From a young age she was described as quiet and shy. People said she was withdrawn, not very social. Now we know why. Because even then Joseph's darkness was growing. By the 1970s, Joseph had already shown signs of deviant behavior. In 1967 he was arrested and convicted for attacking a 24-year-old woman in her own home. He broke in and assaulted her at knife point. He served just 12 months of an 18-month sentence, and after 15 years the crime was erased from his record under Austrian privacy laws. Not a trace of it would appear on background checks in the decades that followed. But the warning signs were there, loud, clear, and ignored. Neighbors noticed he was strict, controlling. His children were expected to obey instantly. His wife rarely spoke when he was in the room. His relatives would later describe him as a man who commanded silence with just a glance. One of Elisabeth's brothers said it best: "When my father walked in, everything stopped." Inside the Fritzl home, Joseph was the only voice that mattered. And by the time Elisabeth turned 11, that voice had turned into something even worse, a predator's whisper. But no one outside the home knew what was happening. Not yet. Because monsters don't always live in the woods. Sometimes they sit at the dinner table. And sometimes they build rooms in silence. On the outside, Josef Fritzl looked like he was simply renovating his home. To the neighbors in Amstetten, he was a man who liked to keep busy, always in his overalls, digging in the yard, working late in the basement. He told them he was building a fallout shelter, something many Austrians were doing at the time due to Cold War fears. He even applied for official building permits from local authorities. Everything looked legal. Nothing raised a red flag. But Joseph wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for something much darker. With his background in electrical engineering, he knew exactly how to hide his plan in plain sight. Using his skills, he began to construct a secret underground bunker, a space not just hidden, but completely sealed off from the world. He didn't hire workers. He did most of the digging himself. He removed soil 1 wheelbarrow at a time, loading it quietly into his car trailer, then driving it off to dump it far from home. The cellar would have no windows, thick concrete walls, and multiple reinforced doors, some steel, some cement, each one more secure than the last. To get to the final room, a person would have to pass through 8 doors, several of them locked with coded entry systems. One door was hidden behind a wall of shelves stocked with paint cans. Another was built into a concrete wall that gave no hint of what was behind it. Inside, Joseph installed soundproof insulation, ventilation, a toilet, a bed, and a few lights connected to a generator. He made sure the ceiling was low. He made sure the air was tight. He made sure no screams could be heard from the outside. At one point, to explain away the mess from all the digging, he even built a swimming pool in the backyard, pretending it was part of the renovation. All of this took years to complete. And all of it was meant for one purpose: to hold his daughter captive. Elisabeth Fritzl had already tried to escape once before. When she was 16, she ran away and hid with a friend. But police found her and returned her home, not knowing what she was running from. Her father had already started mistreating her by that time. But she never told anyone. Maybe because she was scared. Maybe because she knew no one would believe her. By 1984, Elisabeth was 18 years old and had just finished a training course to become a waitress. She was making plans to start a job. She had dreams of being independent. She was young and wanted something better. She wanted out. Joseph knew that. And that's when he made his final move. On August 28, 1984, He called Elisabeth into the basement, asking her to help him with something. He said he needed assistance lifting a heavy door into place. It sounded innocent. She had helped him in the workshop before. She followed him down the stairs. He pointed to the final door. She held it steady just like he asked. As she did, he moved behind her. There was no struggle, no loud noise. Josef pulled out a cloth soaked in chemicals and pressed it over her face. Within seconds, she was unconscious. That would be the last time Elisabeth saw the outside world for the next 24 years. Josef dragged her limp body through the last door and locked it behind them. He chained her to a post inside the room. Then he walked back upstairs, washed his hands, and went to bed. The next morning, when Elisabeth didn't show up for work, her mother Rosemary panicked. She had always been worried about Elisabeth's rebellious streak. She knew Elisabeth had tried to run away in the past, and now she feared something terrible had happened. She filed a missing person report with the local police. But Josef already had a story ready. He told the officers that Elisabeth had run away again, this time to join a religious group. He said she had packed her bags in secret. He said she didn't want contact with the family. He acted calm, disappointed, but understanding. Weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was handwritten by Elisabeth. The note said she was fine, that she had joined a group, and that she didn't want anyone looking for her. The handwriting matched. The story seemed to check out. But what no one knew was that Josef had forced her to write that letter while chained underground. To her mother, the letter was heartbreaking, but it was proof she was alive. So the case was closed. The police believed Elisabeth had left of her own will. Her name was taken off the missing persons list. And with that one forged note, Josef Fritzl had erased his daughter from the outside world. For the next 2 decades, no one would ask questions. Because in Amstetten, Josef Fritzl was just a strict father. Just a retired engineer. Just a man who worked in his basement and kept to himself. No one imagined he was hiding a prison beneath his own home. And above that prison, life carried on quiet, normal, and completely unaware. When Elisabeth opened her eyes, she was in darkness. At first, she didn't know where she was. The air was cold. The walls were damp. Her arms were stiff, and as she tried to move, metal clanked. That's when she realized she was chained. Her hands were fastened to a metal post. There was barely enough room to shift her body. The only light came from a flickering bulb above her head. And the silence was so heavy it felt alive. She called out. No one answered. She waited. No one came. For the first 2 days, Josef didn't return. He left her there in complete silence and darkness. No food. No water. No explanation. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a warning. A message: you have no power here. When he finally returned, he brought food and a few supplies, but not kindness. There were no apologies. No concern. He had locked her away like she was nothing. And from that moment on, he controlled everything. The light, the air, the food, her movement, her voice, her future. At first, she stayed chained at the wrists. Later, he loosened the restraints and secured a metal chain around her waist. It allowed her to move only a few steps in any direction. She was still trapped, just with a little more room to suffer. The room was silent, but her thoughts were loud. She cried every day in those early months. Not just from the pain, but from the confusion. The betrayal. How could the man who raised her do this? What had she done to deserve it? Would anyone ever find her? She didn't know it yet, but no one was even looking. Josef had told the world she ran away. And everyone believed him. Elisabeth would spend the next 5 years completely alone with him in that bunker. She never saw another human face. Never heard another voice. And each day, Josef came down not to comfort her but to assert his control. There were days he brought food. Days he didn't. There were days he yelled. Days he sat silently and watched her. He rarely spoke kindly. And he never allowed her to feel like a person. The absence wasn't just physical. It was mental. It was emotional. It was designed to erase her from the inside out. The space itself was a nightmare. The air was stale. The bathroom was just a bucket. Mold grew in the corners. Rats came in during heavy rain, scratching the walls and chewing through wires. In summer, the room became a suffocating oven. In winter, her fingers went numb from the cold. But somehow through all of it, Elisabeth stayed alive. She started to write. On scraps of paper. On the back of old calendars Josef brought down. She marked time. She told herself stories. She held on to her memories like rope, because letting go of them would mean letting go of herself. Then, in late 1985, everything changed again. Elisabeth found out she was pregnant. At just 19 years old, she was about to give birth alone in a concrete cell with no help, no medicine, and no way out. The first pregnancy ended in heartbreak. In the early weeks, she began bleeding heavily. There was no doctor. No emergency care. The stress, the hunger, the fear, it all became too much. The baby didn't survive. Elisabeth was devastated. But she had no time to grieve. Josef didn't allow it. Life moved on, and so did he. In August 1988, 3 years into her captivity, she gave birth again. This time to a baby girl. She named her Kirsten. The birth happened right there on the cold floor of the cellar. No nurse. No pain relief. Just Elisabeth, alone, doing everything she could to keep herself and her baby alive. She cut the umbilical cord with a pair of scissors Josef left for her. She wrapped the newborn in old towels. She fed her using the supplies he gave: formula, cloths, bottles. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Despite everything, Kirsten survived. And for the first time in years, Elisabeth wasn't alone. Now she had someone to protect. In 1990, she gave birth again. This time to a boy, Stefan. He too would grow up underground, never touching grass, never hearing the wind, never seeing the sky. In 1992, she delivered her third child, Lisa. But Josef had a new idea. He told Elisabeth that the cellar was becoming too crowded, that Lisa would be better off upstairs. So one night, he took the infant, placed her in a cardboard box, and left her on his own doorstep pretending she had been abandoned. He forged a letter from Elisabeth saying she couldn't care for the baby and begged her parents to raise her. When Rosemary found the child and read the letter, she believed it. After all, Josef told everyone Elisabeth had joined a religious group and wanted nothing to do with the family. Lisa was taken in as a foundling. Officials allowed Josef and Rosemary to legally care for her. No one questioned the story. He did it again in 1994 with another daughter, Monica. Then again in 1997 with a boy named Alexander. Each time he repeated the same act. Leave the child outside, show the note, pretend to be shocked. And each time the system failed to ask the right questions. Meanwhile, Elisabeth remained below, raising the other children on her own. Kirsten, Stefan, and eventually a seventh baby, Felix, born in 2002, all stayed in the cellar. They had never seen a bird. Never felt sunlight. Their world was made of walls and wires. There was barely enough food. Josef brought supplies every few days, but never enough. Elisabeth had to ration baby formula, reuse diapers, boil water for bottles, and find ways to keep 3 children alive with almost nothing. There were no books at first. No toys. No birthdays. Just a TV, which Josef eventually installed, but even that was only used under his control. When he was angry, he would turn off the power, plunging the entire space into silence and darkness. Diseases spread fast in such a place. The children had pale skin, weak bones, and delayed development. Their teeth rotted. They coughed in the stale air. And Elisabeth had to act as their doctor, their teacher, and their mother, all while being denied everything herself. She made the walls feel less cold by drawing flowers, animals, and stars. She invented stories for them, tales of oceans, forests, and castles, things they had never seen. She taught them how to read using old magazines and books Josef allowed later on. She gave them hope, even when she had none left for herself. And through all this, Josef came and went, holding full control over their lives. He brought food. He took away children. He smiled upstairs and terrorized downstairs. But Elisabeth never stopped fighting. Not with fists, with faith. She had no way of knowing how long she'd be down there. But every time she held her children, she reminded herself of one thing. They were worth surviving for. By 2008, the hidden cellar beneath Josef Fritzl's home had held Elisabeth captive for nearly 24 years. The walls were still cold. The air still stale. But things had changed. The small space that once held only one frightened teenager now held an entire hidden family, 3 children living underground, never once seeing daylight, and a mother still fighting to protect them. Elisabeth had done everything in her power to keep them alive. But she didn't have doctors. She didn't have fresh air. And she didn't have control over what came through that locked door. By this time, her eldest daughter, Kirsten, was 19 years old. She had never been outside. She had never walked freely. Her bones were fragile. Her body underdeveloped. And her immune system dangerously weak. Then one night in April 2008, Kirsten collapsed. Her body went stiff. Her eyes rolled back. She began shaking uncontrollably. Elisabeth panicked. This wasn't like the colds or coughs she'd treated before. This was different. Her daughter was barely breathing. And no matter what she tried, cool water, cloths on her forehead, prayers, Kirsten didn't respond. She was dying. And Elisabeth knew she couldn't save her. After all these years of surviving in silence, she did something she had never dared to do. She begged Josef for help. She pleaded with him to take Kirsten to a hospital. At first he said no. He was afraid of being caught. Afraid that any crack in his story would lead to the truth. But Elisabeth didn't stop. She cried. She pleaded. She told him plainly, if she dies down here, it's your fault. Josef finally gave in. On April 19, 2008, after nearly 2 decades of hiding her existence, Josef carried Kirsten unconscious and barely breathing up the stairs. It was the first time she had ever left the cellar. He drove her to the Amstetten hospital and left her with doctors. He told them a strange story, that Kirsten had been left on his doorstep years ago, and that she had grown up in his care. He said her mother had been part of a religious group and didn't want contact. But the doctors took one look at Kirsten and knew something wasn't right. She was extremely malnourished, pale, and in critical condition. She had no ID, no medical records, no school history. No proof that she had ever existed. The doctors immediately notified police. Investigators tried to verify Josef's story, but they couldn't find a trace of this so-called mother. No group, no church, no old records. Just a teenage girl with failing organs and no past. Doctors asked Josef to get in contact with the mother. They told him she needed to come forward and explain what was happening. But Josef stalled. He said he didn't know how to reach her. He said she moved often. Still, questions kept piling up. The Austrian police made a public appeal. They released statements through the media urging the mother of the girl believed to be named Elisabeth to come forward and explain her daughter's condition. For the first time in nearly 24 years, Elisabeth heard her name outside the cellar. Josef returned to the bunker angry and scared. He told Elisabeth she needed to stay quiet. He said if she told anyone what happened, she'd be arrested. That her children would be taken away. That no one would believe her. But Elisabeth didn't listen. Her daughter was lying in a hospital bed, barely alive. And Elisabeth had reached her limit. After everything she'd endured, she couldn't let her child die in confusion without answers, without love, without a name. So once again she begged. She asked Josef to let her go with him to the hospital. She promised not to run. She promised not to speak out. She said she just wanted to be with Kirsten. Josef hesitated. He was losing control and he knew it. But he also knew he couldn't keep the lie going much longer. On April 26, 2008, Elisabeth Fritzl walked out of the cellar for the first time in 8,516 days. Her skin hadn't touched fresh air in over 2 decades. She looked around nervously, holding Stefan and Felix close to her. They were as unfamiliar with the world as she was. They didn't know what traffic was. They didn't understand sunlight. It was all new, all terrifying, and somehow also hopeful. At the hospital, Josef introduced Elisabeth to the staff as the long-lost mother of the sick girl. He said she had returned from the religious group to be with her daughter. But the doctors weren't convinced. Elisabeth was quiet at first, visibly shaken. She didn't say much in front of Josef. But eventually she asked to speak to them alone. She was taken to a secure room, away from the man who had imprisoned her. Once she knew he couldn't hear her, she did something unbelievably brave. She wrote a note. It was short, shaky, but it said what needed to be said. She had been held underground by her father for 24 years. The police were notified immediately. Elisabeth was moved to a private location for questioning. But officers didn't pressure her. They gave her time. They assigned a female officer to speak with her gently. And after 2 hours, Elisabeth did something no one could have expected. She told them everything. The years of silence broke open like a dam. She told them about the chains, the cellar, the children, the births, the abuse, the letters she had been forced to write, the 3 children Josef took away, the 4 she had kept with her underground. It was all real. Police arrested Josef Fritzl that same night. He was walking calmly through the hospital when officers approached. He didn't fight. He didn't deny it. When they asked if he was the father of Elisabeth's children, he simply said, "Yes. And I'm also the grandfather." The secret that had lived beneath their feet for nearly a quarter of a century had finally been exposed. The day Josef Fritzl was arrested, he didn't shout or resist. He didn't ask why. He simply went with the officers, quietly, like a man who knew his time was up. At the police station he sat across from investigators and, at first, said very little. But when he was told that Elisabeth had spoken, when he realized the full truth had finally escaped the walls of that cellar, he sighed, leaned forward, and confessed. He admitted to locking his daughter in the basement in 1984. He admitted to being the father of her 7 children. He admitted to keeping her hidden for 24 years, to writing the fake letters, to lying to his wife and the entire community. The officers were stunned by the depth of the story, but not as stunned as the world would be. Within days, news of the case exploded across headlines. Reporters from all over the globe descended on Amstetten. People stood outside Josef's house in shock. Neighbors wept. Strangers left flowers. Some simply stared in disbelief. They had lived next to him for decades. They'd waved to him, borrowed tools, shared meals. And yet, he had built a prison beneath their feet. He was called many things, but one name would stick: the monster of Amstetten. As the case moved to court, prosecutors began building a timeline of horrors: hundreds of pages of interviews, medical records, photographs, and handwritten notes. But there was one voice they knew had to be heard most of all: Elisabeth's. After much thought, Elisabeth agreed to give her testimony not in person, but through a recorded video played privately for the courtroom. In the video she described everything: her abduction, the years of isolation, the births, the fear, the loss of identity, and the way she tried to stay strong for her children. Her voice never shook. Her words were clear. But the pain in her eyes was undeniable. Those who saw it later said it was the most powerful evidence in the entire case. And on the final day of trial, something extraordinary happened. Elisabeth, now free, healing, and protected, entered the courtroom in disguise. She wore a wig and sat quietly in the back. No one recognized her at first, not even Josef. But when he turned around and saw her, his daughter, the woman he had stolen nearly a lifetime from, their eyes met. For a brief moment, the courtroom froze. And then Josef Fritzl, once the man who held complete control, lowered his eyes and began to shake. He whispered to his lawyer. Moments later, he stood up and changed his plea to guilty on all charges. He was convicted of unlawful imprisonment, neglect with severe consequences, repeated assault, deprivation of liberty, family abs, and a charge linked to the loss of one of the children who died shortly after birth. On March 19, 2009, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was transferred to a facility for offenders with severe psychiatric disorders, where he remains today. Officials say he spends his days alone, rarely speaking, often scribbling in notebooks. Some say he avoids mirrors. Others say he talks to himself. But the story did not end with his punishment. Because while the world watched the fall of a monster, Elisabeth and her children were beginning a life they had never known before. After the rescue, Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children were moved to a secure, undisclosed location. A home with large windows, trees, open space, a garden, a real kitchen, real light. For the 3 children who grew up upstairs, it was confusing. They had to come to terms with the lie they had been told that their sister was actually their mother, that the man who raised them had done unspeakable things. For the other 3, it was like being born all over again. They had to learn what the sky looked like, how to walk in grass, what sunlight felt like on skin. Everything was new, and everything was frightening. But Elisabeth held them close, just like she had in the dark. She was still their mother, still their protector. And now for the first time she was free. Psychologists, counselors, and trauma experts worked with the family to begin healing. They were given new names, new documents, and complete anonymity. No press was allowed near them. Authorities even sealed the cellar with concrete so no one could ever step foot in it again. Elisabeth received counseling, and with time she began speaking again, slowly, carefully, but with strength. She found courage in simple things, watching her children run through open fields, cooking in her own kitchen, reading bedtime stories out loud without fear. What she survived is almost impossible to understand. But she did survive. And she turned that survival into something powerful, not just for herself, but for the children who never asked to be born into a prison. This wasn't just a crime. It was a secret war waged in silence. And Elisabeth Fritzl survived it with unimaginable strength. She was locked away for 24 years, but the moment she walked out of that cellar, she proved that even in the darkest places, light can still break through. If this case chilled you to your bones, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Wednesday Crime Gist, where we explore the darkest minds and the bravest survivors every single week. And remember, some people wear masks for years. Some hide their monsters behind smiles. But truth always finds a way out. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe,